He was gathering dirty laundry when the bombs started falling. It was early on the morning of December 7th, 1941, at the U.S. Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and Mess Attendant Dory Miller had just gone on duty aboard the battleship USS West Virginia. 6'3" and 225 pounds, Miller was the ship's heavyweight boxing champ, but as one of the ship's black mess attendants, he cooked and cleaned for the white sailors. A torpedo hit the ship. Sirens and a voice. "Japanese are attacking. All hands, general quarters." Miller's assigned battle station had already been destroyed. He ran to the deck. The surprise attack was rocking ships all over the harbor with explosions. A direct hit on the West Virginia sent flames and shrapnel flying. An officer saw Miller and shouted for him to help move the wounded, carrying them further from the fires. Miller spotted a dead gunner beside an anti-aircraft gun. He'd never been instructed on how to handle those, but he'd seen it used. That was enough. He took aim and blasted away, downing at least one Japanese plane. More torpedoes hit the West Virginia, and she listed to port and took on water. The captain, mortally wounded, ordered abandon ship. After the attack, an officer who had witnessed Miller's bravery recommended him for the Navy Cross, the highest decoration given by the Navy, for distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor. Early in 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz personally pinned the medal on Miller. Nimitz declared, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race. I'm sure the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts." Then Dory Miller, one of the first American heroes of World War II, went back to collecting laundry. He was still just a mess attendant. It was the only position open to black men in the U.S. Navy. Now the U.S. was at war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in a radio address from the White House, said,
"We are now in the midst of a war, not for conquest, not for vengeance, but for a world in which this nation and all that this nation represents will be safe for our children."
Trucks with roof-mounted speakers blared the call to arms. Patriotic, red-blooded Americans, join the Navy and help Uncle Sam hit back. For black Americans, this was not so simple. When they volunteered to fight as sailors, they were reminded of the Navy's long-standing policy. They could only serve on ships as mess attendants. The policy was as old as the country. George Washington told recruiters in 1775 to stop signing up black soldiers, though they had already fought in the opening battles of the Revolutionary War. Slave owners feared armed rebellion. In some states, Britain tried to emancipate slaves to fight for them. 2 years of losing changed Washington's mind. Eventually, about 5,000 black men helped win the American Revolution. So it was after the Civil War. The border states, which had had slavery before the war but were still in the Union, objected. So again, after losing for a while, they were called on. More than 200,000 black soldiers fought to save the Union and end slavery, but in segregated units led by white officers. Hundreds of black soldiers charged up San Juan Hill in Cuba with Teddy Roosevelt, in segregated units, though they took the hill together, and Roosevelt and white volunteers got the credit. So in World War I, 350,000 in segregated labor battalions. The military decided black men wouldn't make good combat soldiers, but under command of the French army, they fought and fought well. The Harlem Hellfighters spent 191 days in combat, longer than any white American unit. They returned as heroes, but the U.S. policy did not change. Then the Depression hit, the racially progressive for his times, FDR took charge, and some began to talk more seriously about desegregating the military. Then, the world was at war again. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, insisted there was nothing he could do. Segregation and racism were deeply rooted in American society, not the military's problem. Aboard ships, close quarters made segregation impossible, and white sailors would not work well with black sailors or take orders from them, so desegregation of the Navy, now of all times, would hurt the war effort. FDR agreed. To go the whole way at one fell swoop would seriously impair the general average efficiency of the Navy, he said. But he was a politician, and because of the New Deal, black voters, a historically Republican constituency, were beginning to vote Democratic for the first time since they could vote. So, FDR looked for a compromise. From 1942, the Navy would accept black volunteers for training as sailors, but only in low ranks, and not aboard ships except as mess attendants. Black newspapers were not impressed. The Louisville Defender said the Navy insults the intelligence of the Negroes it should seek to enlist. The Pittsburgh Courier, if Negro youth are not good enough to fight alongside their white fellow Americans, then talk of democracy is hollow and meaningless. The Navy went ahead with the plan. 17-year-old Jack Crittenden spoke at his high school graduation of Dory Miller's inspiring heroism at Pearl Harbor. When more black men are given the opportunity to serve their country, they will prove themselves worthy of the trust placed in them. Give them a chance. Another teenager, Percy Robinson. We wanted to serve, and we wanted to get into combat because all we were ever taught was that we were cowards, not capable of competing with the white man. Martin Bourdenave lied about his age and enlisted at 16. At 17, with a parent's signature, Robert Routh tried to join the army, telling his father, "If you sign for me, I can help make the country a better place for us blacks." But the army office was closed, and a Navy recruiter signed him up. Joe Small's path to the Navy also involved chance. He and a friend, at their physicals upon being drafted, were asked, "Which service?" They hesitated. The doctor picked up a stamp that cast Army as the fate of the friend, and Navy for Small. That random stamp is an essential element of their story. Small had been in the Civilian Conservation Corps, and at 18 discovered a quality he hadn't known he possessed. He broke up a fight among men armed with axes who had been cutting brush. He jumped between them and demanded they hand over their axes. His boss said he had natural leadership ability and made him a squad leader. This was a pattern. Small didn't ask for respect. He naturally commanded it. He didn't ask for leadership roles. People just turned to him for advice or to settle disputes or to speak up to bosses on their behalf. The men in his division would look to Small as a leader and a spokesman, and it was those same qualities that officers would point to when they accused Joe Small of leading the largest mutiny in the history of the U.S. Navy. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. This is my co-host, Jollibee the Durian. All the other curiosities are on their week of paid vacation, except for Thimble, who's in jail again, and welcome to Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. In the beginning, Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil, and that's how we get everything we know as American music. Johnson was a black Mississippi Delta bluesman, born in 1911, sometimes considered the most influential single musician of all time. Not that he would have known that. Often called the inventor of what would eventually become known as rock and roll, one of the less glamorous rock traditions that Johnson pioneered was dying at 27. In his case, he was probably murdered by a jealous husband whose wife he'd flirted with. In death, Johnson's legend grew and grew, especially when, much later, early rock stars began to cite him as an influence. He became almost something of a folkloric trickster figure to black Southerners, and a popular story has it that Johnson sold his soul to the devil at a remote Mississippi crossroads one night, and that's how he developed his legendary guitar skills. Which might have been something Johnson himself claimed while he was alive, but he probably meant it as just a turn of phrase, meaning that he'd started out doing religious, gospel numbers, and transitioned to secular music. One of Robert Johnson's best-known songs today is a blues number called Sweet Home Chicago. It's become an entry in the Great American Songbook, covered by everyone under the sun, from the Blues Brothers to Barack Obama. Baby, don't you wanna go? And has been named as one of the city of Chicago's official city anthems. But if you listen to Robert Johnson's original lyrics, it doesn't seem to be about Chicago. Chicago. To the land of California, to my sweet home Chicago. Most covers of the song have done away with the California reference because it's confusing as all hell, and quite what Johnson meant by that will never be known. Some people say that since Johnson was poor, never had much of an education, never traveled out of the South, maybe he just thought Chicago was in California. But that's a stretch. He was literate, he had been to school. Or maybe it's aspirational. It's a let's get out of this town kind of song. Let's move from the Mississippi Delta to somewhere lots of black people were moving to at the time, to California or Chicago, both major destinations in the Great Migration. But also, there's a place called California in Chicago and a place called Chicago in California. There's a major street in Chicago called California Avenue, so maybe Johnson knew someone who lived along there. But an overlooked lead is the discovery by musicologist Alan Greenberg that Johnson had a cousin who lived in Port Chicago, California. The city anthem of Chicago may actually be about an entirely different place, a town that only existed for about 20 years, way out in the yellow grass of the parts of the Bay Area that people from San Francisco will say isn't actually the Bay Area, and what became, for a few years, possibly the first black majority city on the West Coast. And here is where we lay our scene. Joe Small and the other recruits were sent to the U.S. Naval Training Center in Illinois, north of the famous Chicago, along the shore of Lake Michigan. It was exciting being away from home and so young, but there was another side to it. They felt like unwelcome guests. At meals, there were two lines, one upstairs for whites, the other downstairs to separate tables for blacks. They hadn't realized how completely segregated the Navy was going to be. Housing, bands, sports teams, everything. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Daniel Armstrong, made an attempt to decorate the place with murals of black naval heroes, but he wouldn't allow black recruits into the specialized training to be electricians, radio men, mechanics. He didn't think they were smart enough. He didn't even let them try. The Navy knew there was no difference, but it was tradition, and no one in power wanted to challenge it. For 12 weeks, the would-be sailors marched and scrubbed and stood at attention, practiced shooting, and took swimming lessons. They were never trained to handle explosives, but weren't surprised by this. They had no idea it was something they would soon need to know. They guessed about where they would be sent next. Cyril Shepard knew about the policy. When I come to fight, I don't want to come fighting with pots and pans. Spencer Sykes, a teenager from Florida, was so eager to join the fight that he got his mother to sign him up when he was 17. Most of us, a lot of us, wanted to go overseas and wanted to shoot, get into combat, agreed Percy Robinson. We figured that by serving and fighting and dying in the service that when we got back home we would get better rights. Robinson felt that he had to prove himself in combat in order to win rights already guaranteed in the Constitution. They boarded trains headed west with no idea of their destination. In California, they were put on buses, taken to a base about 30 miles northeast of San Francisco, a flat stretch of land on Susan Bay, with a few wooden buildings, empty space, and a pier at the waterfront. Their new home? The Port Chicago Naval Magazine. Disappointed to not be at sea, there was bigger disappointment ahead when they were driven a mile to the waterfront and shown the work they would do. A huge Navy ship was docked alongside the 1,200-foot pier, boxcars on the railroad tracks. Crews were loading heavy bombs and crates of ammunition out of the train cars and onto the ship. All the officers standing on the pier and giving orders were white. All the sailors handling the explosives were black. Captain Nelson Goss, the commanding officer here, didn't want black workers, and the feeling was mutual. Most of the men obtainable from these races do not compare favorably with those of the white race, he said. He had a mission to get done, and he felt that they could only do 60% as much work as whites. Soon after arriving, Robert Routh heard fellow sailors grumbling in the barracks. "Ship us anywhere. We came to fight. Let us fight." The white officers had been given a brief course on the safe handling of bombs and ammunition and spent a few hours at San Francisco Bay ports watching professional stevedores loading ships. That was the extent of their training. It was more than the black sailors got. They were never even given any written manuals. Some safety regulations were posted on the pier, but not in the barracks, where the men might have had time to read them. Officers didn't think the black sailors would be able to understand written regulations. It was a recipe for disaster, and civilian stevedores in the Bay Area were horrified. Years of experience on the job were needed to do it safely. The Longshoremen's Union offered to send trained loaders to teach the recruits. The Navy never responded. Most of the men lived in constant fear of catastrophic explosion. 17-year-old Spencer Sykes was convinced he'd die at the base. "I'll never see my mom again." Joe Small was an early riser. from a young age, and the other men counted on him to get them up and headed to chow. My father didn't believe in me depending on help, Joe would later explain. He taught us to be independent. On his family's farm in New Jersey, Joe had done chores in the field and around the house. At 14, he went to a local truck stop and tried driving a truck. It didn't go well. The driver let him attempt it as a joke, it seemed, and Joe was narrowly missed by some of its cargo of logs smashing through the cab. At 15, he got a job driving for a furniture company. At 16, he finally got his license while trying to keep up with school. A white kid taunted him, calling him Smokey, and then ducking behind the protection of his 200-pound cousin. Small was appropriately named at 5'7", but never one to back down. One day, the boy showed up without his hulking cousin. "I put a good whipping on him," said Joe Small. Joe was offered expulsion or reform school. It was the end of his formal education. Small was 22 when he got to Port Chicago, a few years older than most of the men. He had more experience, more confidence. He demanded respect and got it, explaining how he came to be seen as the unofficial leader of his division. Their day's work started at 6:45 when Lieutenant Ernest DeLucci ordered them to fall out for inspection. Short, stocky, in his early 30s. He looked like an old guy, Percy Robinson remembered. I didn't like him too well. Very hot-tempered, Joe Small added. If things didn't go his way, he was very quick to punish you for it. But Small managed to stay on his good side. DeLucci recognized his leadership skills and assigned Small the job of marching outside the ranks and calling cadence. At the ship, the men divided into 5 groups of about 20 men, each team loading bombs from boxcars onto one of the 5 hatches in 2 squads, one on the pier, the other in the hold. We'd open the boxcar doors, Small described, and the bombs would be stacked 4, 5, or 6 high in the car. Planks made a ramp from the top of the pile down to the pier, where the ship was cushioned with mattresses in case one of the 500-pound bombs rolled too fast and hit the ship. It happened all the time. You'd hear this all day long. Boom, 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 Percy Robinson remembered, and that would almost give you a heart attack, said Freddie Meeks. Several times he asked the officers if there was any danger of an accidental explosion. Their response was always the same. Don't worry about it. They didn't have the fuses, the detonators, yet. Won't concussion blow this thing up? Small asked. Impossible, said DeLucci. Then the men lifted the bombs and smaller ammunition crates into nets. Cranes with winches lowered them into the hold. After the top layer went the hot cargo, 650-pound incendiary bombs, with fuses already attached. The scene was chaotic, frantic, stressful, loud, bombs clanking, winches chugging, sailors swearing, and officers urging them on. We were all afraid of an explosion, Small said later, but there was very little you could do about it. I mean, you had a day's work to do. Joe Small was fascinated by the winch operator's job, the only one that required technical skill. As a truck driver, he soon learned it. A medical emergency gave him the opening. They let him take over that day, and eventually, typical for Joe, he took it over completely. The men thought Joe Small should be at least made a petty officer, the highest rank given to black sailors at Port Chicago. But DeLucci said he was too young. He got the responsibility but not the benefits. DeLucci would come to him instead of the division's actual petty officer. When the men had a complaint for DeLucci, they went through Small. Each division worked an 8-hour shift. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, the loading continued. 8-day weeks, 3 days loading, 1 duty day for laundry and the like, 3 more loading, then 1 day's liberty. Port Chicago, the town, about a mile away, didn't have much to offer, or much like for black people among the townsfolk. Pittsburgh, California, had 1 bar that would serve them, beyond a 5-block maze where they were accosted, uniforms notwithstanding. Oakland was an hour away by bus. Robert Edwards struck up a friendly conversation with 2 white sailors headed the same way, and they went for a drink. Ordering 3 bottles of beer, the bartender gave them 2. We don't serve here. Edwards turned and walked out alone, got on the bus back to Port Chicago. We're supposed to be fighting the same enemy, he said. I don't know who my enemy really is. Robert Edwards' experience was far from unique in World War II America. Black newspapers received a steady stream of letters from African American soldiers and sailors describing the lousy treatment they were getting in the military. A soldier on a segregated base in Colorado wrote, "We're treated like dogs." Lining up outside the mess hall, he and the other black soldiers were told to wait until the white men finished eating, and then were served cold leftovers. A base in Alabama had 5 seats at the movie theater designated as colored seats. Any more than 5 who wanted to see the film were out of luck. At a base in Georgia, black soldiers were woken up an hour before white soldiers to clean the toilets in the white barracks. At Tuskegee Airfield, in Alabama, the Army was training the country's first group of African American fighter pilots. It was an important step forward, yet even there, black pilots were confronted with white and colored signs over the toilets. It was even worse in civilian towns near military bases, especially in the South. In a letter to a newspaper, Corporal Rupert Trimmingham described a scene that became famous as a symbol of the hypocrisy of segregation in an army that was fighting for freedom around the world. His train stopped in a small Louisiana town and wouldn't leave until the next morning. His group tried to buy a meal in a restaurant. Not a single one would serve them. Finally, the lunchroom in the station agreed to feed them, but only if they'd come around to the back entrance and eat standing up in the kitchen. Then came the bigger slap. About 24 German prisoners of war, guarded by 2 white American soldiers, entered the station, walked into the lunchroom, took tables, and were served right away. They ate and talked, laughed and smoked cigarettes. "Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Why are they treated better than us?" said Trimmingham. "If we are to die for our country, then why does the government allow such things to go on?" No single lawyer could possibly handle the avalanche of abuses reported by black soldiers and sailors, but Thurgood Marshall was willing to try. He was the lead attorney for the NAACP, based in New York. Many years later, he'd be the first black justice on the Supreme Court. At just 34, Marshall was already known as one of the best civil rights lawyers in the country. When black servicemen needed help, Marshall was the man they turned to. A typical case was about a black Army private named Reeves Bell. He was standing on a street corner in Mississippi, chatting with a couple of women. 4 white civilians strode up. One pushed Bell, and a second snarled, "Where'd you get that uniform?" "From Uncle Sam," Bell said. "Take off that soldier suit," another demanded. 2 of the men grabbed Bell, and the others began punching and kicking him. The police stopped the fight, but only arrested Bell. He was charged with assault, found guilty, and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Thurgood Marshall collected evidence like this and sent it to the War Department, demanding they do more to protect its men in uniform. The response was always the same. Segregation was a way of life in much of the country, and the federal government had no intention of interfering in local customs. This enraged Marshall, but never discouraged him. His fight for justice was deeply personal. Thurgood Marshall grew up in a completely segregated Baltimore. At 15, he got a job making deliveries for a clothing store. On one trip, on a trolley, holding hat boxes he couldn't even see over, he got in trouble for bumping into another passenger. "Don't ever push in front of a white lady," the man shouted. "Damn it, I'm just trying to get on the damn bus," said a teenage Thurgood Marshall. "Don't you talk to me like that." Marshall's father had said, "Anyone calls you that word, you not only got my permission to fight him, you got my orders to fight him." He fought the guy down to the sidewalk. A cop pulled them apart. Only Marshall was arrested. When his boss came down to the station to bail him out, Marshall apologized for the ruined hats. The elderly Jewish man put his arm around Marshall's shoulder and said, "It was worth it, if you're right." He never stopped fighting, but he found more effective tools. In detention at school for his many troubles, he was made to memorize the Constitution. He was stunned to discover the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, that forbade states from denying any citizen equal protection under the law. Segregation was not only immoral, it was unconstitutional. He decided to become a lawyer and prove it in court. He traveled all over the country with his typewriter, defending falsely accused black people in town after town. There were many cases, and some turned violent. Private Edward Green, ordered to move back from a white-only row on a bus, said he'd rather get off the bus than change seats. After they exchanged words, the driver followed Green down the street, pulled out a pistol, and killed him. The state declined to prosecute the driver. The Justice Department refused to investigate. The driver kept driving, with his murder weapon by his seat. Stories like these didn't make the mainstream newspapers, but they were reported in black newspapers, and all over the country, including at Port Chicago, black soldiers and sailors read the stories and wondered why the government allowed such injustice to go unpunished. Marshall wrote to the Justice Department, "I hope you can realize the effect on the morale of the Negro soldiers. Although one of their members is killed without provocation, the same government for which they are fighting refuses to take any action to prosecute the guilty party." Both civilian and military leaders said segregation was a fact of life. One general said, "The urgency of the war situation does not justify experimentation." "Things are slowly coming to a head," warned a black sailor from a base in Virginia. "All it needs is one little incident to light the fuse." In April 1944, Captain Merrill T. Kinn took over command of Port Chicago. His solution to keeping the ammunition moving was to introduce competition by posting the daily tonnage moved by each division on a chalkboard by the pier. It was as fast as you can go, Percy Robinson said of the pace of work. It was a challenge. It was pressure, remembered Albert Williams. It was a rush, rush, rush. An official Navy report would later declare, efforts were made by the officers to bring home to the men the necessity for care in the handling of explosives, but that was after, when the officers were scrambling to deflect blame from themselves. The men who did the work at Port Chicago were told a very different story. Joe Small was alarmed when he realized that Lieutenant DeLucci and other officers were placing bets on whose division could load the fastest. If he decided to make $100, Small said, DeLucci would bet the commander of the 2nd Division that his division could put on more tonnage. If Small's division fell short, they had to deal with a very unhappy lieutenant. The job was essential. They realized that. Troops needed ammunition and fast, but what bothered them more than the dangerous working conditions was the feeling that they'd been singled out for this work because of their race. The Navy considered that all sailors had dangerous jobs. There was no discrimination or any unusual treatment of these men, but they ignored one point. Segregation was discrimination. That they weren't allowed to fight was discrimination, and the black sailors felt it, even if the white officers believed that the jobs were separate but equal. By July 1944, there were 1,431 black enlisted men at Port Chicago and 71 white officers. The base was guarded by 106 Marines, all white. Monday, July 17th was beautiful, clear and hot. Robert Routh said he felt a great foreboding, I don't know why. At the pier, the cargo ship E.A. Bryan was being loaded with 8,500 tons of bombs and ammunition, about half of it already aboard. Joe Small and Division 4 finished work at 3 o'clock and rode back to their barracks as fresh crews took over loading. For Spencer Sykes, it was a Liberty Day. He had a date with a woman he'd recently met in Berkeley and prepared to go out to a movie with her. That date really saved my life, he later said. At 6 p.m., a second ship, the Quinault Victory, tied up across the pier from the Bryan. 16 boxcars holding 430 tons of bombs and ammunition were lined up on the pier. Marines on the Coast Guard patrolled. A little after 9 p.m., several crew of the Quinault left the ship for a few hours of liberty. Most stayed aboard. Captain Kinn came down for a look, saw that all was well, got back in his jeep, and drove to the officers' quarters. 10 p.m. Lights out, quiet about the deck. In the enlisted barracks, men settled into their bunks.
If you are watching this, the daring commando operation to free me from Thimble's captivity has succeeded. Thank you, Husolino and Sluds, for that. So I am free now, but I still haven't made $10,000 from the Tor's Cabinet store, so you really should help me with that, you know? I was thinking back when I was being held captive in Thimble's washing machine, I was like, you know, the silver lining to this is at least I'll make $10,000 from the Toys Cabinet store, and now that doesn't seem to be happening. So get there, get on the store, get some cool mouse pads, get some cool t-shirts, get some cool mugs. The only mugs, t-shirts, mouse pads you will ever need. Actually, the Toys Cabinet store is like the movie in Infinite Jest. It is the apotheosis of all entertainment, and once you have visited torscabinet.com/STOR, you will not want to look at anything else. It's actually very evil in that way and should be illegal. Go to the Tours Cabinet store right now.
Go!
At 10:18 p.m., Joe Small was still awake. He heard what sounded like a thunderclap coming from the direction of the pier. "Oh my God, we're being bombed!" someone shouted. Men looked out the windows in the direction of the sound. Then, just seconds after the first blast, came a much more massive explosion. The sky lit up, and it's just like the sun rose, Percy Robinson remembered. The shockwave hit the barracks, breaking the windows into flying shards of glass. Routh, who was looking out toward the pier, took glass shards in both his eyes. The blast lifted Small straight into the air and flipped him over. He landed with his mattress on top of him, lucky protection from the shower of glass and wood splinters. Cyril Shepard remembered. Men were screaming. Glass was flying all over the place. The whole building was caving in. Wooden beams supporting the second story were giving way. Men raced outside as the building tilted over. Unable to see from his wounded eyes, Routh called out, "Hey, come and get me and take me to the sick bay." Someone shouted back, "The sick bay has been blown up." Lieutenant Commander Glenn Rehnquist had a closer look at the blast than the men in the barracks. He had left the pier at 10:15 p.m., just 3 minutes before the explosion, driving away from the pier in his jeep. The sky lit up. He jumped out of the car and watched a column of smoke and red flames shooting thousands of feet into the air. And then darkness set in, Rehnquist said, and fragments started to fall. Fiery hot chunks of metal, some over 100 pounds, rained down all over the base. An Air Force pilot cruising above Suisun Bay witnessed the blast from 9,000 feet. A huge ring of fire spread out on all sides, he later reported, and there were pieces of metal, white and orange in color, hot, that went a ways above us. They were quite large. In a cafe in the town of Port Chicago, Morris Rich and another sailor on liberty from the Connaught Victory had just ordered sandwiches. They never got them. The explosion found them across the room. It blew us out of the booth, clear across the room. Rich stumbled into the street and stood among raining hunks of steel, looking down toward the pier. He knew instantly that everyone on his ship was dead. Captain Kin ran out of the officers' quarters and looked toward the water. "What happened?" someone shouted to him. "I don't know," he said. "I think the ships blew up." Falling debris had ignited grass fires, spreading toward several trains full of ammunition. A team of enlisted men and officers were working together to put out the fires, and they seemed to have things under control. There was no appearance of panic or disorder, Kin would later report with pride. Outside of the barracks, quick-thinking sailors had flipped on truck headlights. In the light, men with only minor scrapes treated the more seriously wounded. Percy Robinson tried to join an impromptu crew of volunteers heading down to the pier, but he was too badly hurt. Cyril Shepard was among those who jumped in a truck and sped toward the water, but when they got near the pier, the driver stopped. "Go on down! What the hell are you staying up here for?" guys in the back shouted. "Can't go no further," the driver said, pointing out at the bay. Everyone stood up and looked. The pier was gone. The ships were gone. The truck lights shone out on an empty patch of water. Low waves lapped at the shore. It wasn't until sunrise that the men at Port Chicago got a clearer look at the scene of devastation. The huge open space leading down to the water was dotted with piles of rubble, burned grass, splintered wood. One 200-pound chunk of gray steel, part of one of the ships, lay more than 2 miles from the pier. The 1,200-foot pier was simply gone. The locomotive and boxcars on the pier had disintegrated. The only piece of the Connaught Victory in sight was its upright stern. Of the E.A. Bryan and its 10 million pounds of explosives, nothing remained visible. It was one of the biggest man-made explosions in history to that point, and remains one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions of all time. Of the human remains pulled from the bay, only 51 bodies were whole enough to identify. There had been more than 300 people at the waterfront at the time of the blast. It was headline news all over the country. Every single person aboard the 2 ships, and everyone on the pier, had been killed instantly. A total of 320 men were dead, 202 of them black sailors who'd been loading ammunition. Another 390 men, mostly sailors in the barracks, were injured. At a press conference, Captain Nelson Goss was asked about the cause of the explosion. "We have no basis for giving any cause, as there were no close survivors to give evidence of what happened," he said. Admiral Carleton Wright, one of the Navy's top officials on the West Coast, spoke of the vital contribution the victims had made to the war effort, and he praised the men of Port Chicago for fighting fires and aiding the wounded. 4 days later, on July 21st, the Navy convened an official court of inquiry to determine the cause. But there were no living witnesses from less than a mile away. The smaller explosion must have sparked the bigger one, but what caused that? Handling of the explosives was an issue. Some of the younger officers testified about Captain Kin's policy of posting tonnage figures, encouraging competition between divisions, but Kin insisted this had no impact on safety. The Navy agreed. Unsafe practices and speed were not permitted by anyone in authority. The real problem, insisted many of the officers, were the black sailors. The consensus of the witnesses, summarized the official report, is that the enlisted personnel are neither temperamentally nor intellectually capable of handling high explosives. It is an admitted fact, supported by the testimony of witnesses, that there was rough and careless handling of the explosives being loaded aboard ships at Port Chicago. But witnesses referred only to the white officers. Surviving black sailors who had done the loading didn't have a chance to tell their stories. The court never asked them to testify. Transferred to nearby Camp Shoemaker, the black sailors were not told when they would be put back to work or doing what. With nothing to do but wait and think and wonder, their nerves were stretched to the breaking point, and they began taking apart the furniture and fiddling with the ceiling fan purely out of boredom. Congress began considering a bill to compensate victims. At first, it was going to be $5,000 grants to families of dead servicemen and residents of the town. But John Rankin, a rabidly pro-segregationist House member from Mississippi, objected because many of the families getting money would be black. Congress reduced the maximum to $3,000, about $50K today. The Pittsburgh Courier blasted in an editorial, "What did they die for? Why did those heroes risk death? Black servicemen were part of the worldwide fight for freedom, right? Negro Americans rallied even though they knew the American way was for them something different and something less from what it is for the white Americans. Letters began to pour into Thurgood Marshall's New York City office. He and his 3-lawyer staff took as many cases as they could. "We must not be delayed by the people who say the time is not ripe," Marshall told an NAACP conference in July 1944. "Persons who deny to us our civil rights should be brought to justice now. Many people believe the time is always ripe to discriminate against Negroes. All right then, the time is always ripe to bring them to justice." He didn't know he was about to get a chance to take the fight for justice directly to the U.S. Navy. At the beginning of August, Joe Small and the other Port Chicago men were moved to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo on San Pablo Bay. They didn't know what the Navy had planned, but ships were being loaded there with ammunition. At some point during that first week of August, a list circulated through the barracks, and many of the men signed it. The sailors later said it was a petition requesting a transfer to some other type of duty. The Navy would insist it was a list of people who intended to refuse to load ammunition. We'll never know, because the list disappeared. Joe Small explained years later, "I was instrumental in having it destroyed. Some serious decisions were coming up, he knew, and it was best to put nothing in writing." On August 8th, they were issued new gloves, the same type they had used on the pier in Port Chicago. They were for handling ammunition. The Navy would later charge that the sailors held a secret meeting in their barracks that night, but there was nothing secret about it. They discussed the orders they were likely to get the next day and how they were going to respond. Some didn't want to go back to loading. All were terrified of another explosion, but didn't sailors in combat face at least as much peril? They wanted to know what Joe Small thought. He hadn't made up his mind. "I was a winch operator. I missed killing a man on the average of once a day, and it was all because of rushing, speed. So I came to the conclusion that I was not going back to the same work under the same conditions, under the same men, and that was it." The next day, August 9th, the men of Joe Small's division were sent to lunch early. At 11:15 a.m., Lieutenant DeLucci ordered Division 4, Turn 2 for work. Many of the men still wore bandages on their arms and faces from the explosion. There was a bit of milling around, DeLucci later said, and he had to hurry them into formation. Other divisions watched. They marched in ranks toward the river, Joe Small on the left side calling cadence to a T-shaped turn in the road. To the right, it led to the parade ground. To the left, down to the ferry, which crossed the river to the loading dock. A left turn meant loading ammunition. "Column left," DeLucci ordered his petty officer, Elmer Boyer. "Column left," Boyer shouted, and then one of those moments, seemingly small, that changed the course of history. Someone in the ranks stopped. Or maybe many men stopped at once, memories varied. Either way, they came to a stop in the road. Men were looking around. Some seemed confused. DeLucci: "Will you go back to work?" No one answered. "You're going to load this ship," he said, pointing across the water. Percy Robinson heard someone near him, it's not clear who, mutter, "Oh no we ain't. We're not going to go." Joe Small marched to the front and stood face to face with Lieutenant DeLucci. "Small, will you return to duty?" "No, sir," said Small. DeLucci glared. "Is that final?" "Yes, sir, that's final." Someone back in the ranks, again it's not clear who, called out, "If Small don't go, we won't go either." DeLucci's face flushed blood red, and he marched off, leaving his division at the crossroads. He went to report to his superiors. A chaplain named Jefferson Flowers came out and tried to persuade them to get on the ferry. They said that they would obey any other order, he would later testify, but they would not handle ammunition. He reminded them that other sailors and soldiers faced enemy fire in foxholes. They couldn't just stop because they were afraid. A few broke into tears as they considered this. "You can fight in foxholes," someone called out, "but you can't fight back here." DeLucci came back and lectured them about letting down the nation and the black race. "There are a lot of people who are working for the Negro people, and it won't help the Negro people any if these people withdraw their support when they find out about how you men are acting." The executive officer, Joseph Tobin, sped up in a jeep and told DeLucci he wanted to speak to the sailors individually. He marched his division to the recreation building, where they took seats in the auditorium and waited their turn, as Tobin called them into his office, one by one. "You have been ordered by your division officer, while in formation, to report to work at the ammunition depot," Tobin told each man. "You refused to obey this order. I am now ordering you, individually and personally, as commanding officer, to report for work immediately." A few of the men agreed and marched down to the ferry. Joe Small, Percy Robinson, and most of the others refused to go. Tobin warned them of grave consequences of disobeying orders in time of war, probably court-martial, he threatened. Many told Tobin they would obey any order except for the one to handle ammunition. Tobin angrily explained that in the Navy it wasn't up to an individual sailor to decide which orders to follow. Marched out to the baseball field, they were guarded by armed Marines. Robinson said later, "I felt like I was being mistreated. I had no other recourse to fight back, but refused to go back to work." Meanwhile, there was more trouble. That afternoon, Lieutenant Carlton Morehouse mustered Division 8, 104 men, and told them the division's orders were to take the ferry and load ammunition on the USS Sangay. Many of these men had watched Division 4 stop in the road 2 hours before. Now it was their turn to decide. "I order you to load ammunition with me," Morehouse told his division. "All who are willing to load with me stand fast. Any who refuse to obey this order fall out." Many of the men began stepping out of the ranks. In the confusion, Morehouse couldn't tell who was and who wasn't willing. One by one, he ordered each man to step forward. "I order you to load ammunition with me. Think before you answer, because a refusal means severe disciplinary action. Will you load ship with me? Yes or no?" 8 men said yes. 96 said no. Half an hour later, Lieutenant James Tobin, no relation to the EO, called Division 2 together to begin loading the Sangay. After some sorting out, just 26 men of Tobin's division agreed to load. 87 did not. Of 328 sailors scheduled to load that day, 258 had refused. They were marched under guard down to the river, where a barge was tied to the pier. As they did, DeLucci pulled Joe Small aside, and they had a very short conversation. The details of what was said would become a major point of contention between the two, but they agreed the gist was that DeLucci wanted Small to help see that the men of Division 4 behaved themselves and followed orders on the barge. Then, Small walked into the floating prison. On the barge, packed in like sardines, they talked about whether to give in and go back to loading ammunition. 2 men would get to fighting, right there on the barge, Small recalled, because one thought he should go back to duty and another thought he shouldn't. One sailor, just 17, quietly confessed to Small that he wanted to go back. "You can, but I wouldn't advise it," Small responded. "The men were in this together, and they should see it through together. If we go back as a unit, that's one thing, but if we go back one at a time, then the one that goes back will be looked on by the others as a traitor." The young man agreed to stay. Another day, and their anger grew at the unfair conditions they had faced in the Navy. At meals, Small noticed a few of the men sneaking spoons or forks back onto the barge. "I saw spoons made into knives, forks made into knives." The Marines on the pier warned the prisoners that they didn't want to fire into the crowded barge, but they would, if they felt they had to. "It was a pretty hairy situation," Small remembered, "and I got into it to try to offset a disaster that I saw coming." He huddled with a few other men the sailors looked to as leaders, and they agreed that it was time to call a meeting. Word spread quickly, and nearly everyone jammed together, Small in the center. A confrontation with the guards would be bloody and disastrous, Small told the men. Besides, acting defiantly and disorderly was just playing into the officers' hands. "The officers want us to do something, to have something on us. If we obey the shore patrol and the officers, and don't get into trouble, they can't do anything to us. More strongly, we've got the officers by the balls. If we stick together, they can't do anything to us." It only lasted 4 minutes, and the mood was calmer. The men obeyed orders and had no trouble with the guards. They wondered what would happen to them if they kept refusing to load, but talk of giving in had died down. Small was determined. Improve working conditions, this is what I, personally, was after. And desegregation of the base. August 11th, day 3 on the barge. Lieutenant DeLucci and the others called for their divisions to step off the barge and were marched to the baseball field. They formed a U-shape, with Marines around them holding machine guns. A jeep brought in the brass. "In case you don't know who I am, my name is Admiral Wright, and I am the commandant of the 12th Naval District." Admiral Carlton Wright passed among the rows of prisoners as he spoke. "They tell me that some of you men want to go to sea. I believe that's a goddamn lie. I don't believe any of you have enough guts to go to sea." He leaned forward as he paced. "I handled ammunition for approximately 30 years and I'm still here. I have a healthy respect for ammunition. Anybody who doesn't is crazy. But I want to remind you men that mutinous behavior in time of war carries the death sentence. And the hazards of facing a firing squad are far greater than the hazards of handling ammunition." The prisoners were stunned. This was the first they'd heard about mutiny or the death sentence. "I'm going to let you all know that I personally will recommend mutiny, and death will be the penalty." Percy Robinson stood in shocked silence. He can't be telling the truth. A few in the ranks began crying quietly. How could it be mutiny? Martin Bordenave wondered. I didn't talk to nobody, didn't conspire with nobody. I just made up my mind I was tired of it, you know? I wanted to be a sailor. The 3 lieutenants stepped up. DeLucci announced to Division 4, I have been ordered by my superior officers to order you men to go to work. All men willing to obey all orders anywhere at any time, fall in behind me. The men faced a life-changing decision with just seconds to make it. Joe Small stepped forward, but hesitated and went back. I realized the order could be to load ammunition, and that's one order I wasn't willing to obey, he said. Percy Robinson, we didn't even know what mutiny meant. We thought mutiny was something like when you kill people or take over something. We didn't know disobeying orders could be mutiny. We thought mutiny could only happen on a ship. He had no doubt about Admiral Wright's threat. I'm not going to give them the chance to shoot me. I'll go back to work. Of the 258 men on the baseball field, 214 lined up behind their lieutenants. 44 men stood apart. Next morning, guards led 6 more sailors onto the barge. They had initially agreed to work, but wavered when it came time to load the ships. All 50 prisoners were taken to Camp Shoemaker and locked in the brig. Only Small was placed in solitary confinement. 4 days later, he found himself in an office with Admiral Wright. Small, you are the leader of this bunch, Wright said. If you return to work, the others will. Not under the same conditions, Small said. Wright glared. If you don't return to work, I'm going to have you shot. You bald-headed son of a bitch, go ahead and shoot, Small told the Admiral. It couldn't have helped his case. He regretted losing his temper, but not his refusal to give in. What they expected me to do was just go back to duty and forget everything. They assumed if I went back to duty, everybody would follow me. But I had what I considered a legitimate reason for not going back to work. Routh, who'd been blinded in the blast, followed the story from his hospital bed. Go on, brothers, he said to himself. If not for the wounds in his eyes, it would be 51. Small was privately just as shocked by the charge as any of the men. I didn't consider refusing to work mutiny. We weren't trying to take over anything. We didn't try to take command of the base. We didn't try to replace any officers. We didn't try to assume an officer's position. How could they call that mutiny? Legally, he was right. The Navy defined mutiny as an unlawful opposition or resistance to or defiance of superior military authority with a deliberate purpose to usurp, subvert, or override such authority. Captain Nelson Goss, in his report to Admiral Wright, said, There are undoubtedly agitators, ringleaders among these men. They've always been present since such personnel were first received at this depot. He claimed he was patient, but that the sailors displayed a consistent attitude towards discrimination, never justified as far as I could ascertain. The disposition, however, to seek opportunity to complain against fancied discrimination has always been present among present-day Negro enlisted personnel. Wright sent his own report to the new Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, who had taken over the job in May. After outlining the facts, he gave his personal theory of the cause of the trouble. The refusal to perform the required work arises from a mass fear arising out of the Port Chicago explosion. This fear is unreasonably associated with the handling of ammunition in ships. That was it, just irrational fear. The way Wright saw it, neither the Navy's racial policies nor the chaotic working conditions on the pier played any part in the men's refusal to return to work. A considerable portion of the men involved are of a low order of mentality, the Admiral commented, echoing a prejudice held by many officers. Wright defended the use of black sailors to load ammunition, and yet he admitted that it looked very bad to have only black sailors doing the loading. At the end of the report, Wright asked permission to make a major change. He wanted to begin training white sailors to work some of the shifts at Port Chicago and Mare Island. Secretary Forrestal approved the change and passed Wright's report to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt sent a brief note back to Forrestal suggesting light punishments for the 208 men who had eventually agreed to go back to work. They were activated by mass fear. This was understandable. As for what to do with the 50 sailors still refusing to work, Roosevelt left that to the Navy, but he forwarded the report to his wife, Eleanor, writing, "For your information" on the top. This was significant because Eleanor met often with black leaders and was an outspoken critic of racial discrimination. He knew she'd keep an eye on the case of the alleged mutineers. The men who returned to work lost 3 months' pay. The 50 in the brig, half of them teenagers, were officially charged with mutiny. The prosecution would be led by Lieutenant Commander James Coakley, who had been the district attorney in Alameda County. He spent a few weeks gathering evidence among the accused, especially Joe Small. Coakley questioned many of the 50 personally. He demanded to know if Small had led the mutiny. "No," said Edward Waldrop, one of the 50. "Well, somebody has got to be the leader," Coakley insisted. "Everybody needs a leader." "Nobody made me do nothing. We don't need a leader if you know what's going on that base." James Tobin, the lieutenant of the division, questioned Jack Crittenden, with a Marine guard looking on. "Tell me what happened on that barge." "Lieutenant, I don't know what went on that barge. I was a scared jackrabbit on that barge." This became a common theme of the interrogations. Officers wanted details of the meeting. Coakley was convinced this was a central part of Small's secret plan. "I didn't say the things he wanted to hear," Crittenden remembered. "That made the Marine guard so mad I thought he was going to beat me up when I came out of there." Guards later led Joe Small to the office of Lieutenant Lewis Bannon, a legal officer at Camp Shoemaker. Coakley was there. Bannon asked Small how it was that the men happened to stop on the road the morning of August 9th. "I guess they sensed something wrong." Bannon wasn't satisfied. The refusal to march had to have been planned ahead of time. Small explained that he had talked to no one about whether he would load, but many of them talked to him. There wasn't one that didn't have something to say on the subject. Bannon turned to the barge meeting of August 10th. Small admitted he called the men together, but his goal was to prevent a deadly eruption of violence between prisoners and guards. The officers saw him as the leader of a carefully crafted rebellion. It simply hadn't been like that, Small knew. But Coakley was determined to prove his theory in court. Pressing the men who had returned to work, a few told him that Small had said something about sticking together and having the officers by the balls, or by the ass, or by the tail. Memories differed. Coakley was now absolutely convinced Small's goal had not been to prevent violence. It had been to keep the group unified, to stop anyone wavering from giving in and going back to work. Coakley was sure the 50 men were guilty of premeditated mutiny. He was sure that Joe Small had planned and orchestrated the whole thing. The court-martial was set to open on September 14th. The Navy hastily assigned Lieutenant Gerald Veltman to lead the defense, age 34, and gave him 4 young lawyers to assist. They didn't even have time to meet with each of the accused before the trial. But Veltman was hopeful. He had spotted a few weaknesses in the case against the accused mutineers. Treasure Island, California, September 14th. A barracks had been cleared of beds and set up as a courtroom. Behind a table on one side of the crowded space sat Rear Admiral Hugh Osterhaus and the 6 other members of the court, all of high rank. There's no jury in a court-martial. These 7 officers would hear the evidence and decide the fate of the accused. On the other side were smaller tables for the prosecution and defense, and a few more chairs for newspaper reporters. These were not normally invited to military trials, but this was no ordinary court-martial. It was the largest mass trial in the history of the United States Navy. Naval leaders didn't want it shrouded in secrecy, and they hoped that the public trial would serve as a warning to any other servicemen who were thinking of bucking the system. Coakley called on each of the 50 and asked them the same question. "You have heard the charge and specification preferred against you. How plead you in the specification of the charge, guilty or not guilty?" All 50 responded exactly the same. "Not guilty, sir." Coakley's strategy was to build the argument that there had been a conspiracy. They planned to refuse to work and planned to stick together. First, the basics of what happened at Mare Island. He called Joseph Tobin, the EO at Mare Island. He had given the order to have 3 divisions from Port Chicago load the USS Sangay. He had talked to many of the men individually after they stopped in the road. A number of the men took the attitude that they would obey any order except to handle ammunition. To those I explained that the choice of duty did not rest with any individual in the naval service. He told how those still refusing were taken to the barge, were assembled for Admiral Wright's talk, and how even after being accused of mutiny, they would still not load ammunition. Gerald Veltman stood to cross-examine Commander Tobin. He understood Coakley's strategy. His plan was to undermine the prosecutor's case every step of the way. He would not be intimidated and aggressively challenged Coakley's witnesses, even the high-ranking officers. "Commander," Veltman began, "I believe you stated they," meaning the accused, "would obey any order except loading ammunition. Is that correct?" The attitude of the men was that they would obey what they chose to obey, Tobin replied. "That wasn't the statement a while ago, was it, Commander?" "That is the statement of fact, regardless of what was stated earlier." "Did they tell you they would obey any order they wanted to?" asked Veltman. "They implied that in the words they used." "Did any of these men tell you, of the ones you talked to, did any of these tell you that they were willing to obey any order except loading ammunition?" "A number did." "In other words," Veltman concluded, "there wasn't a complete disrespect for your authority?" Coakley jumped to his feet. "Just a minute," he said. That is objected to on the grounds that it is too broad and indefinite and calls for the conclusion of this witness. I will withdraw the question, Veltman said. But he wasn't done with this line of questioning. It was vital to his strategy. The Navy's definition of mutiny said, a deliberate purpose to usurp, subvert, or override authority. The Port Chicago men had resisted a specific order, but had they really tried to seize power from their superior officers? If not, they weren't guilty of mutiny. Veltman believed making this distinction clear was his best chance to save their lives. Turning to the days after August 9th. Did you ever have any riots? Veltman asked Tobin. No, we never had a riot. Did you ever have any trouble, specific riotous trouble with these 50 accused during the time, the 9th, 10th, or 11th of August? Yes, we had trouble. With these 50? Yes. What was the trouble? Refusing to obey orders? I am talking about their personal actions, Veltman clarified. I mean in connection with riotous actions. There was. Did they storm about the depot? Just answer the question. Oh, no, said Tobin. Did they attack anybody? No. Did they back you up in your office and tell you you couldn't order anybody to do anything? No. Did they interfere with the prerogatives of your office in any way? Again, Coakley jumped up to object. I'm going to sustain that objection, Admiral Osterhaus told Veltman. The question you asked is certainly immaterial. I don't know that it is immaterial, Veltman argued. It is an element of mutiny, if it please the court, to usurp the power and authority of the commanding officer. The objection is sustained, Osterhaus ruled, but Veltman had made his point. For his second witness, Coakley called the man he had expected to give the most damaging testimony against the accused, Lieutenant Ernest DeLucci. Now, while you were in front of your division, began Coakley, did you hear any remarks from any of the men, either in your own division or the 8th Division, with reference to whether they would go to work or not? Yes, sir. Will you state what the remarks were? I heard at least 3 times the statement, don't go to work for the white motherfuckers. Did you hear any other remarks like that? Don't turn to for work. This was devastating testimony, Coakley knew. The comment seemed to show that the men were hostile toward their officers and planned to defy authority that day. It happened again on August 11th, DeLucci testified. Admiral Wright had addressed the men on the baseball field, and DeLucci was walking up to his men to once again order them back to work. As you approached the division, Coakley coaxed his witness, state whether or not you heard any remarks in the ranks of the men of your division. Yes, sir, I did. What did you hear? Let's all stick together. Coakley asked if DeLucci heard anything else. Yes, DeLucci responded. The first remark I heard was, the motherfuckers won't do anything to us. They're scared of us. They won't even send us to sea. Did you hear any other remark? Yes, sir. What was it? Let's run over the motherfuckers. This was some of the most important testimony of the trial, and there's no way to know if it was true. Coakley couldn't find a single witness to corroborate the quotes. The only other people who could possibly have heard them would be the defendants and the other black sailors. Maybe they chose to forget a detail they knew would hurt the accused, or maybe, as many of the Port Chicago men believed, DeLucci was flat out lying on the stand. Either way, Veltman knew that the mere suggestion that sailors had used foul and threatening language toward their officer was sure to make a strong impression on the judges, all officers themselves. In his cross-examination, Veltman skillfully limited the damage by exposing a major flaw in DeLucci's version of events. Now, you have attributed, in the record, a number of statements of profanity or words that aren't used in common society to some men, Veltman said to DeLucci. Isn't that right? That is right, sir. Will you look at the accused and identify the men that said that? I can't, sir, because I had my back to them. Then, when any of those statements were made, you didn't see who made those statements? Veltman asked. No, sir. You don't know who made those statements? No, sir. And you don't know absolutely that it was any member of your division? Yes, sir, DeLucci insisted. I am reasonably sure it was the men in my division. You say reasonably sure. I am asking if you know absolutely for sure. Yes, sir, I do. How do you know that? For the simple reason that my division was behind me, said DeLucci, and the wording came from behind me. The wording coming from behind you, do you know that it was any of these accused? No, sir, DeLucci admitted. I can't really testify as to whether it was any of these men. That was the key point Veltman was trying to make. Satisfied, he sat down. The mutiny trial on Treasure Island was a minor story in most newspapers, but black people across the country watched it closely. We concede the fact that a superior officer's command is to be obeyed, but we know that prejudice exists in the Navy, Irma Lewis, an Oakland woman, told the newspapers. We mothers want to know why these loading crews are all Negroes. Joseph James, president of the San Francisco branch of the NAACP, was also following the story. The Negro people are well aware of the pattern of discrimination practiced by the Navy, James told papers, and they are very much concerned about this trial. He alerted the New York City headquarters, letting Thurgood Marshall know that this was a case worth watching. The Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, was keeping an eye on the trial from his office in Washington, D.C. He'd been thinking about the Navy's segregation policy. It was wasteful, causing unnecessary problems, damaged morale of the men, and led to headaches like the trial on Treasure Island. Forrestal was well aware of the basic assumption that packed together white and black sailors simply wouldn't get along, and that during a war was no time to make a major change in operations. He suspected it was nonsense. With the backing of President Roosevelt, Forrestal approached Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral, I'd like to make a change in our racial policies, Forrestal began. The President wants it, and I want it. How do you feel? I don't know if you can do it, King said, but if you want to try, I'll back you up every step of the way. That summer, Forrestal and King began an experiment. The Navy assigned black sailors to serve alongside mostly white crews on 25 large, non-combat ships. King told the ship's commanding officers to report back on the results. Coakley, back on Treasure Island, continued his prosecution. He examined the white officers and then the men who agreed to go back to work after Admiral Wright's threats. These were key for Coakley, who intended to show that they had conspired, agreeing on a secret plot ahead of time. The accused denied that any such plot existed, but Coakley was hoping for a different answer from some of the men who went back to work. He called one Edward Johnson to the stand, who explained, well, the fellows said that they didn't want to load ammunition because they were afraid of it, and that it would be better for the rest of us to stick together. That was all. What else? That's all. At this time, I certainly claim surprise, Coakley shouted. He was clearly annoyed with the witness. He'd questioned Johnson in private before the trial, and now he didn't get the story the way he wanted it. Trying again, Coakley asked, state whether or not you heard some men in the 2nd Division say, if we stick together, the Navy won't do anything to us. We are too large a group. Yes, sir, Johnson said. Veltman, in cross-examination, went after this seemingly damaging testimony. Who made the statement, if we stick together, the Navy won't do anything to us, we are too large a group? He asked Johnson. I can't remember, Johnson said. Gesturing to the men in the back of the room, Veltman asked, can you identify the man of this 50 who made such a statement, Johnson? No, sir. Did you hear any of these 50 men say that they would not load ammunition? No, sir. Did you ever try to get anyone not to load ammunition? No, sir. Did any of these 50 try to get you not to load ammunition? No, sir. Coakley called several witnesses to testify about the so-called list. He hoped it would show the existence of a mutiny plot. It didn't. What was on the paper? We, the undersigned men, are willing to work but refuse to load ammunition, apparently. Veltman, in cross-examination, asked, was the word refuse in there? I'm not sure, sir. You're not sure? No, sir. Could it have been, don't want to handle ammunition? Yes, sir. It could have been. This was a crucial distinction. There's a big difference between don't want to and refuse. Without refuse, it could be seen simply as the men requesting a change of duty. Again, Veltman had done a good job of casting doubt on Coakley's case. Coakley went after Joe Small, the one he supposed was the ringleader. He couldn't find any witnesses to corroborate the claim that Small had urged his fellow sailors not to work before August 9th, but many did describe the meeting on the barge on August 10th. He told us all to obey the shore patrol. Veltman asked, and the purpose of that meeting was for discipline, wasn't it? I will object to that, Coakley cut in, on the grounds that it is calling for the conclusion of the witness. I will withdraw the question, Veltman said, but again, he had made his point. Some testimony was repeated day after day with minor variations. Several of the officers at the judge's table were seen nodding off at various points. one consistently snoozed in his seat after lunch. Family members of the accused worked to draw attention to the case, urging the NAACP to provide legal help. Thurgood Marshall had heard enough. He was ready to take on the fight. There is no sufficient evidence of mutiny or conspiracy, Marshall told reporters in late September. These men are being tried for mutiny solely because of their race. Marshall asked for, and got, Secretary Forrestal's permission to sit in on the trial. In early October, he flew to California. Coakley wrapped up his prosecution on day 10, and Veltman began to call witnesses for the defense, starting with the most important, Joe Small. Coakley singled him out as the ringleader, and Veltman believed his answers could swing the verdict one way or another. He described the explosion and the men's mood in the days afterward, including the story of the sailor who thought it was funny to jam his bedsheet into the fan and watch the other men panic. Another night, someone dragged a bunk across the floor, and again, panic. From your observation, would you say that the men were afraid at the time? Yes, sir. This was an important point for the defense, that Coakley had tried hard to block. Veltman wanted the judges to understand how terrified the young sailors were after the Port Chicago blast, to consider the possibility that fear, not a secret plot, was really behind the refusal to load ammunition. Veltman asked Small about lists that circulated in the barracks. Small said, truthfully, that he hadn't signed it. He didn't mention he'd destroyed it. Veltman asked about the now famous barge meeting. DeLucci had put Small in charge of the division on the barge to head off trouble, Small said. Coakley stood up to cross-examine Small. He asked about the column left incident, insisting that Small had made up your mind that you would obey any order except the order to handle ammunition? Yes, sir. Coakley paused. He hadn't expected Small to concede this point, but went on to repeat himself. Will you answer the question, yes or no? Either you refused to go or you didn't. I didn't go. You refused to go, didn't you? Again, Veltman objected. He has already answered this question, Veltman insisted. Withdraw the question. Admiral Osterhaus declared a break for lunch. Back on the stand, cross-examination continued. Coakley tried again and again to get Small to admit that he had convinced his fellow sailors not to load ammunition. Small refused to budge from the story all along. Before August 9th, there had been talk of how they might react. Small himself had made up his mind not to load. But he had not tried to influence anyone else, and there was no secret plot. Thurgood Marshall sat with the newspaper reporters, listening, watching, planning his next moves. Defense counsel are good, and know what they're doing, he wrote of Veltman and his team in a letter to the NAACP head, Walter White. That was the guy's name. Prosecutor is vicious and dumb. There is no evidence of mutiny. Marshall visited with the prisoners. He just said to play it cool and he was working on it, Freddie Meeks remembered, and he really did go to bat for us. Although Marshall liked Veltman as a courtroom lawyer, he wasn't happy with the defense strategy. Nothing at all was being said about the Navy's unequal treatment of black sailors. Nothing about the segregation at Port Chicago, or the unsafe working conditions. Without looking honestly at these factors, the court would never get at the true cause of the men's refusal to load ammunition. The defense lawyers were all naval officers. They weren't going to bring out details that would be embarrassing to the Navy itself. The accused couldn't volunteer anything, only answer questions put to them. Albert Williams felt like a kid being accused by an adult of something he hadn't done. No matter what you say, you're going to get this whipping, he said. Veltman spent the next 2 weeks calling each of the accused mutineers, trying to show that they all had different stories and reasons for their actions, hardly a cohesive group of conspirators. John Dunn, for instance, weighed just 104 pounds. A Navy doctor told him specifically that he wasn't strong enough to load ammunition. He was working as a mess cook on the morning of August 9th, but Lieutenant James Tobin ordered him down to the loading pier anyway. I told him the doctor told me I was too light to work on the dock, Dunn testified. He said, that makes no difference. Tobin told Dunn to step over with those who had refused to work, and Dunn was marched to the prison barge. Julius Dixon had suffered dizzy spells. DeLucci considered him a hazard to his entire division and agreed when a doctor declared him unfit for loading. Dixon spent August 9th working in the mess hall and didn't even know about column left and Division 4 stopping in the road. But, on DeLucci's orders, a Lieutenant, Eugene Kaufman, confronted Dixon in the kitchen. You can't be a mess cook forever, Kaufman chided. I'm not able to load ammunition, Dixon replied. Hearing that, Kaufman ordered Dixon to report to the barge and join the other prisoners. Both Dixon and Dunn were among the 50 accused mutineers, without ever having been ordered to load. Ollie Green had been wounded in the face and chest by flying glass in the blast, but was back on duty with Division 4 in early August. On August 8th, he fell while running to chow, fracturing his left wrist. On August 9th, his arm in a sling, Chaplain Flowers asked him, "Are you willing to go back to work loading ammunition?" "No, sir," Green said, explaining his wrist and that the doctor had put him on the sick list. Green wanted to talk to Lieutenant DeLucci, but never got the chance. He was sent right to the prison barge. He testified that he was afraid, but he would have gone to load if he had ordered to do so. He never was. In cross-examination, Coakley tried again and again to get at least one defendant to admit to being part of a mutiny plot. No luck. He tried again and again to get someone to say Joe Small was behind the whole thing. No one did. Coakley's rising frustration became obvious as he questioned a sailor named Frank Henry. Henry said the list stated only that the men would like some change of duty. Coakley simply could not accept this. Alfonso McPherson, one of the 50, ignited Coakley's biggest tantrum. He described being interrogated by Coakley a few days after August 9th. Coakley seemed unhappy with McPherson's answers and finally said, "I'll give you one more chance. Come clean or I'll see that you get shot." He then immediately tried to deny that he had ever said this, as McPherson quoted Coakley's words back to him. Coakley tried to shake McPherson from his story, but couldn't. "This thing was interjected into the record, which I claim is not true. I never said he was going to be shot," Coakley moaned. "I am not trying to conceal anything here, and I am very indignant about it. It is hitting below the belt. That's all it is, if it please the court." The entire courtroom exploded into laughter. Defendants, reporters, even the judges. The admiral had to slam his gavel on the table to restore order. Coakley's aggressive outbursts convinced Thurgood Marshall that something was very wrong in the Treasure Island courtroom. During tense trials, Marshall was fond of urging his staff to keep cool. "Lose your head, lose your case," was his motto. But after a week on Treasure Island, Marshall was having trouble following his own rule. The NAACP is going to make it its job to expose the whole rotten Navy setup which led to the Port Chicago explosion, and then to the so-called mutiny trial of 50 Negro sailors now taking place, Marshall announced at a meeting of the NAACP in San Francisco. "This is not an individual case. This is not 50 men on trial for mutiny. This is the Navy on trial for its whole vicious policy toward Negroes." As for James Coakley, Marshall told the crowd the man obviously had a problem with black sailors and his prejudice was making it impossible for the defendants to get a fair trial. "I want to know why commissioned officers at Port Chicago were allowed to race their men. I want to know why bets ranging from $5 up were made between division officers as to whose crew could load more ammunition." While Marshall waited for answers, the lawyers on Treasure Island made their closing arguments. "These 50 men are guilty," concluded Coakley. "There is ample evidence to sustain a conviction of all these 50 men." The next morning, Gerald Veltman took his turn. "Gentlemen, we now speak for the accused." He read the Navy's definition of mutiny. Then he asked the judges, "In what way have these accused gentlemen usurped, subverted, or overridden their superior military authority?" The bottom line, Veltman insisted, was that the prosecution had presented no reliable evidence of any kind of plot or any attempt at seizing authority from officers. And without proof of these elements, Veltman concluded, the case of the prosecution most certainly has not been proven. The court was cleared at 11:15 a.m. After an 80-minute lunch break, everyone returned, and Admiral Osterhaus announced the verdict. All 50 men were found guilty. Small and the others were led back to the brig, where they waited several days to find out if they were going to be executed. The identical sentences were 15 years of hard labor and dishonorable discharge from the Navy. The sentences were sent to Admiral Wright for review. He knocked off a few years for some of the youngest men. Small and 9 others were ordered to serve the full 15 years. In November, the Port Chicago 50 were handcuffed and taken to the Naval Disciplinary Barracks at Terminal Island in Southern California, where the Navy confined serious offenders facing long sentences. "Everything was rigged," Small said. "He may have been closer to the truth than he knew." Decades later, Gerald Veltman revealed a shocking detail. Between courtroom sessions, while the accused men were still testifying, Veltman overheard Admiral Osterhaus say, "We're going to find them guilty." The men had one hope. Thurgood Marshall was on the case. Calling it one of the worst frame-ups we've come across in a long time, Marshall promised to fight on. Their real crime, he insisted, was drawing attention to the disgraceful way the United States Navy treated black sailors. He wrote directly to Secretary Forrestal, arguing that the Treasure Island trial had been completely unsatisfactory, leaving every key question unanswered. "Why is it that the only naval personnel loading ammunition regularly were Negroes? Why is it that these men were not given any training whatsoever in the dangers to be found in loading ammunition? Why is it that officers raced their gangs in the contest of loading ammunition? The people were demanding answers, and the answers needed to come from the top. Forrestal must have cringed as he read this. He was hoping the story would blow over. Now, with Marshall on the job, it was not going to go away. The Secretary was not about to admit that the Navy deserved any of the blame for the Port Chicago explosion or the so-called mutiny that followed. Not in public, anyway. Privately, Forrestal was more convinced than ever that segregation was becoming a major aggravation for the Navy, and an unnecessary one. Captains were starting to report on the integration experiment. The assimilation of the General Service Negro personnel aboard this ship has been remarkably successful, went one typical report. To the present date, there has been no report of any difficulty which could be laid to their color. A similar report came from Franklin Roosevelt Jr., one of the president's sons, commanding a destroyer escort. He'd heard grumbling, but then the young men started living and working side by side. Before we reached the Panama Canal, my racial problem had vanished, Roosevelt reported. Forrestal was encouraged and determined to push integration further, but he had to do so quietly, so he wouldn't reduce any of the sentences of the Port Chicago 50. In their cells on Terminal Island, the Port Chicago prisoners kept up with the story through letters from their families and articles in black newspapers. The NAACP helped spread the men's version of events by publishing a powerfully worded pamphlet on the case. Marshall sent copies of it to the prisoners. It was strong stuff, but the men had no idea if it would help. They had to adjust to the daily routine, a mix of boredom and outdoor labor. At Terminal Island, they were known as the guys who'd stood up to the U.S. Navy. "Nobody bothered us," one of them said. Forrestal decided something had to be done. Segregation was actually hampering the war effort. It was time for a new plan whether the country was ready for it or not. The Navy assigned more black sailors to integrated crews aboard ships. The first black officers were assigned to ships at sea. More white sailors were moved into unpopular shore duty assignments like ammunition loading. The change was gradual but real. The Navy accepts no theories of racial differences in inborn ability, the Bureau of Naval Personnel informed all naval officers in February 1945, but expects that every man wearing its uniform be trained and used in accordance with his maximum individual capacity. Forrestal appointed Lester Granger, an African-American civil rights leader, as a civilian advisor. His task was to tour bases all over the world, watch the integration process up close, and recommend ways to improve it. This was an absolutely stunning reversal from just 4 years before, when the Navy considered black men fit only to cook and clean. But the Port Chicago 50 were still doing hard labor in Southern California. In early April 1945, Marshall stood before a board of officers and presented his appeal. "One day, sitting in at that trial would convince you that there was something wrong," he said. Some of the most damning testimony came from statements that DeLucci reported overhearing. It should never have been allowed on the record, and James Coakley, a trained prosecutor, knew it. "He misled the court," said Marshall. "He deliberately set upon a course of getting into the record evidence that he himself knows is inadmissible. When the evidence which is the meat of the so-called mutiny is inadmissible testimony, then the case has to fail." As further proof the trial had been a sham, Marshall pointed out how little time the judges had spent reaching a verdict, an average of 96 seconds deciding each man's fate, assuming they didn't take time off for lunch. He concluded, "Justice can only be done by a complete reversal of the findings." The board assured him they would give it full consideration. There was nothing more Marshall could do. Behind the scenes, Navy lawyers studied the Treasure Island transcript and agreed with Marshall. DeLucci's overhearing unidentified speakers making obscene threats should never have been allowed on the record. In May 1945, Secretary Forrestal's office sent a memo to Admiral Wright telling him the court had made a mistake. Admiral Osterhaus and the other judges would have to reconsider their decision without all the inadmissible evidence. They met in early June. They voted to uphold all 50 convictions and prison sentences. Marshall asked Forrestal for a face-to-face meeting. A long shot, he knew. All the appeals were over. Japan surrendered to the Allies on August 15, 1945. 2 months passed at Terminal Island with no update from Secretary Forrestal. Finally, on October 29th, Marshall got a letter from Forrestal. "I shall be happy to confer with you about this case," read Marshall, "if I felt that any purpose would be served." Nothing changed his mind. The legal process was dead. Much to Secretary Forrestal's irritation, the Port Chicago story lived on. People sent petitions. A few members of Congress began making noises about an investigation. Lester Granger continued reporting on the integration process. It was going well, he told Forrestal, but If the Navy really wanted to show black servicemen it was really serious about change, one convincing step would be to free the Port Chicago sailors. Eleanor Roosevelt was following the case too. Without telling Forrestal how to do his job, she made her position clear by sending him a copy of the NAACP's persuasive pamphlet. With a handwritten note attached, "I hope in the case of these boys, special care will be taken." Feeling the pressure, Forrestal privately reconsidered. The sentences were harsh to send a message about defying orders in wartime. Now they looked extreme. He wasn't about to admit the Navy made a mistake, but maybe he could make the whole controversy disappear. The first week of January 1946, Joe Small was shipped out. They didn't say where. Next morning, he awoke to nothing but ocean in all directions. He turned to a sailor standing nearby. "How far are we from the nearest land?" he asked. "About 2 miles. Seeing nothing but water, Small asked, "Which way?" "Straight down." They looked at each other for a moment, and then burst out laughing. Secretary Forrestal's office didn't announce this until all the men were out of sight of land. It was part of his plan to dispose of the story as quietly as possible. But, aboard Small's ship, the arrival of 5 of the famous Port Chicago mutineers was big news. "When they heard what we'd been through, they said they'd have done the same thing," said one of them. It made absolutely no sense. Why let them off after 16 months? And if they were so dangerous, why send them to sea aboard ships? What they'd always wanted in the first place. The Port Chicago 50 were given the chance to finish their naval service as free men, but they remained convicted mutineers. In 1946, the Navy became the first military branch to officially eliminate all racial barriers. Effective immediately, they announced, all restrictions governing types of assignments for which Negro personnel are eligible are hereby lifted. Henceforth, they shall be eligible for all types of assignments in all ratings, in all activities, and all ships of the naval service. Impressed by the progress in the Navy, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in July 1948. Whereas it is essential that there be maintained in the armed services of the United States the highest standards of democracy, with equality of treatment and opportunity for all those who serve in our country's defense, it is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Truman's order to end segregation in the military was only the beginning of the struggle against segregation in the United States. "We have just begun to scratch the surface in this fight," Thurgood Marshall cautioned. Truman's administration believed he'd lose re-election because of the order, but it was a serious start, a major step forward for the country, and a spark of inspiration for the massive civil rights movement still to come. On Small's ship, a gigantic redhead from Alabama named Alex set his tray down across the table. "By God, this is the first time I ever ate with her!" Small lifted his hot coffee and dumped it in the redhead's face. Then he hit him with the empty mug. Then he dove over the table onto him. Small was fast, but the redhead was big. They couldn't hurt each other and got tired. Finally, the captain intervened. "You want to fight? Put on gloves and go out on the fantail." They did, but after a few minutes, they were too tired to go on. The skipper stepped in again. "All right, knock it off. Shake hands." They shook hands, and from that moment, they were best friends. "Everywhere I went," said Small, "he was with me. On shore leave, they would hit the bars together. 'Gimme 2 beers,' Alex would call. Often the bartender would only set down 1 beer. Alex would slide the glass to Small, glare over the bar, and growl, 'Now give me a beer.' If the bartender so much as hesitated, Alex would leap over the bar, grab a glass, and help himself, then leap back over, and the 2 friends would sip a beer together." During one of the many conversations, Small asked Alex what changed his mind. "I found out something," the big redhead said to Small. "A man is just a man." Things were definitely beginning to change. In early June 1944, just 10 days before the explosion at Port Chicago, a young black officer, Lieutenant Jack Robinson, had boarded a bus at Fort Hood, Texas. The white driver told Robinson to move further back. Robinson refused. The furious driver called for the military police. Robinson and the MPs had an angry confrontation, and Robinson wound up facing a court-martial charged with insubordination. He was found not guilty. It was such a typical case in World War II, hardly anyone noticed. Less than 3 years later, everyone noticed Robinson. On April 15, 1947, at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, Jack Robinson, Jackie to his teammates, took the field as the starting first baseman for the Brooklyn Dodgers. It was a rocky road. Being the first black player in Major League Baseball, some opposing players barked slurs at him when he came up to bat. Some even tried to slice his legs with flying spikes. But change is never smooth, never without resistance. Port Chicago veteran Spencer Sykes saw the aftermath of Truman's desegregation order up close when he re-enlisted in the Navy in 1951, during the Korean War. Things had changed, Sykes said of conditions on his integrated ship, but to some degree the people that were in command, they hadn't changed. The military, to his credit, pushed integration forward. By the time the Korean War ended in 1953, 95% of black servicemen were serving in integrated units. Thurgood Marshall kept on challenging segregation in court and winning. In Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, he argued that segregation of public schools violated the constitutional rights of black children, and the Supreme Court agreed, 9-0. A year later, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks was arrested. A young pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., helped lead a boycott of city buses, bringing national attention. These are the stories we think of as the foundation of the civil rights movement, and rightfully so. But before Brown v. Board of Education, or Truman's executive order, before Rosa Parks and Jackie Robinson, before any of this, there was Port Chicago. Unlike Jackie Robinson or Rosa Parks, the young sailors from Port Chicago aren't remembered as heroes. Their stories aren't taught in school every February. After finishing their military service, the men returned home and quietly got on with their lives. Many of the men, especially those convicted of mutiny, kept the memories buried. For years, Freddie Meeks couldn't talk about what happened. It would hurt inside, he said, 35 years after the war. Albert Williams didn't even tell his wife or children about Port Chicago and the mutiny trial. Like the other convicted mutineers, Joe Small was discharged, quote, under honorable conditions, a category of discharge given to men who performed their duty satisfactorily, but whose record contains some type of disciplinary action. The honorable conditions discharge meant Small was eligible for veterans' health care benefits, but not for the GI Bill, which paid college tuition for veterans, a substantial disadvantage for a young man trying to start a new life. In the decades after the war, Port Chicago veterans and their families worked to overturn the convictions of the 50 men. It's like trying to fight a stone wall, Robert Edwards said of the effort. A UC Berkeley professor named Robert Allen took charge. He spent years tracking down and interviewing men who'd served at Port Chicago, including many of those convicted. But for him, their stories, in their own words, would be lost forever. His 1989 book, The Port Chicago Mutiny, sparked fresh press coverage of the case and documentaries about Port Chicago. This moved several members of Congress from California to petition the Secretary of the Navy to review the cases of the convicted mutineers. The Secretary wrote back saying it was too late to re-examine cases from World War II, but they were free to apply to the President for pardons. A pardon can get a person out of prison, but doesn't erase the conviction. We don't want a pardon, Small said, because that means you're guilty but we forgive you. We want the decisions set aside. In 1994, the Navy did a review, conceding in its report that, quote, racial discrimination did play a part in the assignment of African American sailors to load ammunition at Port Chicago, and they were subjected to segregated living and working conditions, but it went on to conclude that racial prejudice and discrimination played no part in the court-martial convictions or sentences, and there was nothing unfair or unjust about the final conviction of any of the Port Chicago court-martials. The mutiny convictions stood. Joe Small died in 1996, age 75. Freddie Meeks, in declining health, did seek a pardon. Jack Crittenden decided not to, saying he refused to ask forgiveness for a crime he didn't commit. In December 1999, Bill Clinton signed a pardon for Freddie Meeks. It took until the 80th anniversary of the explosion in 2024 for the Navy to formally exonerate everyone involved. All 50 men had died by then. Joe Small summed it up. Things were not right, and it was my desire to make things right. I have never felt ashamed of the decisions I made. I did what I thought was best, and I did it in the best way I know how. This episode owes its genesis to my business manager and sometime co-author Jim, who has a very unusual collection of books. This is another episode based on a book he has, but this one came from a little free library in his neighborhood. We don't know who put it there, that's how these things work, but we owe them a debt of gratitude, and it will go back in circulation there after this is done. Before we decided to tackle this story, Jim sought out his coach, Chuck, who happens to be black. Chuck was genuinely impressed, first, that a couple of white boys from Oregon, as Jim styled us, would even stop to think about whether this is appropriate for us to do, and second, that we would double-check with him. He agreed to read the book, and Jim loaned it to him. Neither Chuck nor his circle have ever heard of the story. He said that, yes, we should go ahead, that Shinkin, the author, was also white anyway, so we won't apologize for making an attempt to tell this story here. It needs telling. The book tells it quite well, and in a video like this, we can only paraphrase it. Read the book. Seriously, we could only do our best. Jim wishes for this episode to conclude with parting words that he wrote. To my shame, I somehow developed a contrary idea to this in my youth, but now I've learned. Black Americans are Americans, first and foremost, and African hardly at all, except for new arrivals. I was brought up thinking that we and my family were German Americans. After 3 generations, some food, a few words, singing O Tannenbaum at Christmas, until I got to Germany. It turns out I'm American, full stop. I like Germany and Germans, but I'm not one of them, not even pretend. I've been to Africa too, to Ghana. One of my mother's best friends, Agnes, was from Ghana. I went to visit them both. Agnes was wonderful, but you could tell who was the American. Black Americans have a unique perspective on America, with elements of subculture to be sure, patterns of speech, etc., all arising from their experience of the intense racial discrimination that continues. But first, they are Americans. They live in the same country, see the same things, sing the same songs, celebrate the same holidays, the same sports, are as patriotic as any other American. This book proves that beyond any doubts. They want the same things for themselves and their children. A stable home, a happy family, fulfillment. The new traveler focuses on the differences where he goes. The seasoned traveler on the similarities. Tor, at 24, is a seasoned traveler, I know. It's too easy, especially for people who have never had the privilege of international travel, to focus on what sets Black Americans apart, when the elements we all have in common are much stronger, and much more important.
Believe in something right, but you do something wrong. Learn